Do you have a second one?
Sorry. Hi, I'm Janet. Just a general question. In terms of engagement, I was kind of struck when you said over 20 years there hasn't been much by way of progress. Have you noticed anything in more recent years? Because like 20 years ago, there was hardly any awareness around climate change and everything. The whole environment has changed a lot. And the other thing is that, and I'm not saying I'm for or against, I'm just saying the reality is that a lot of the companies, the oil companies, are doing things to clean, you know, to make their extraction cleaner. That doesn't alter the extraction question, but it, you know, it does show some concern for the environment. So, I don't know. So given some of those factors, is there a more openness to the companies, or do you still feel that it's really not that great a way to go in terms of the engagement?
Let me just say one question that did come up that's related is, if you want to engage with global equities and those kind of companies, you have to do it as part of coalitions. That's the only possible way to be effective. And there are interchurch coalitions involving US and Canada and Britain and whatever, which have recently put motions again to Exxon and Shell and whatever. So when you engage, you have to really do it on that kind of scale. In the early 90s, both Shell and Exxon had research saying there is global warming and it's burning fossil fuels that are producing it. They were internally aware, while externally really funding denial. It's worse than they weren't doing anything. They were trying to prevent the government regulations and the kind of things that would have reduced their income. So I think on that scale, I don't see any more openness. If there was a fossil fuel company that showed you a plan to say, by 2050, we're going to be out of extraction. We've got a plan, we're moving, we're supporting the transition, whatever, I would look far more seriously. But none of them are offering that kind of a plan. There are some really interesting blogs, and some of those have been circulated on Fossil Free Faith and so on, from individuals and people who worked for the oil companies doing these kind of things and just gave up in frustration before Paris, before the... so there's accumulated experience that we have looked at and we respect.
I would say that there's a question here that underlies everything, and that is the issue around urgency. And we looked at all the various kinds of actions that we as individuals and as church community have taken over a number of years, which include the kinds of things that we've been engaged in conversations with companies as shareholders. We were very careful to say that's drop everything, because we recognize that all of these actions, whether it's writing letters or whether it's making presentations in government circles or whatever, which we've done in the churches in Canada for years together, they have made some progress in certain areas. What we felt was, this is not enough. What you have to do is something very dramatic that says, you no longer have our confidence that your business plan is going to get us to where we need to be in the time limit that we need to be there. And so we're taking our money out. this divestment movement has grown so significantly in the last 2 or 3 years, really significantly, and way beyond the expectations of the people who started the divestment work. It's the fastest growing divestment movement in history. And that is sending a signal as you don't have the social license to do this anymore. And so we just felt like we had to go to that place. We had to go to where we said we are fed up with not being heard in very significant ways that your business plans are changing. We also have to recognize that every company, its key point of business is to deliver profits to the shareholders, right? That's their key thing. And what we're saying is that we will not accept profits that are earned in wrecking the planet. So it's not to say that we said everything else has to quit. Do what you can on that, but we're adding this, and this is going to be our key thing here at this point in time. And I think it's making a difference. There are a number of companies who are beginning to be quite aware of that. And who was it? Shell, a couple of weeks ago, withdrew its support for bringing out some of that oil from the tar sands, a significant amount of it, knowing that they're never going to be able to do it. So they're writing it off as a loss already.
Walter, you mentioned briefly Bathurst United Church's interest in Indigenous rights. Could you say a little bit about how they might have written investment policy or made decisions to align with that and to align with the principles of reconciliation?
I think I have this right. So one of the choices, Bathurst United, I don't know what, it used to own what's now a theater complex down in Bathurst and sold it. They actually made a different decision. They made a decision to completely disperse their endowment for things now. They're not holding an endowment. That's enough, you know, there are social justice groups and whatever applied, and they're going to use it for good work now. So they have done a lot of education work. They did some educational work with us. They made sure that all of the documents that we put forward to Presbytery National and so on included statements about free and prior informed consent. I don't know whether people know the United Nations Declaration on Aboriginal Rights. So they've certainly been doing consciousness raising with us and with our congregation. But the simple answer is I don't think they have an investment policy because they've decided not to hold investments. It's a different approach, and I guess some groups go all the way with it.
Just to say, we also have an Indigenous rights working group in Trinity, St. Paul's, who works with the Bathurst and Bloor Street Indigenous working groups. So it's a joint kind of effort. I think the key thing that we wanted to make sure is that the voices of the Indigenous people were held up front and center as people whose land this was being explored and the stuff extracted from. But we have the copy of our motion that went forward, and with the backgrounder and the paragraphs in there about the Indigenous work that I'll share with you. I was just checking to be sure I had it here, so I'll do that afterwards.
In your divestment, exactly how pure have you been? Like, are we just talking extraction, or have you moved to pipelines and transportation and such?
I think, well, there's, again, I showed two parts of their investment. The really active investment one, which is with certain companies doing, say, run-of-river, hydro, etc., or Siemens. Siemens is on the Clean 200 as we produce controls that's going to take a building and radically reduce its energy. So those are clean. To answer your other question, I suspect we're hearing a presentation from J.P. Harrison at Genus, who can probably answer more clearly, because there are some issues that haven't been fully explored, and I think the issue of free and prior informed consent is one of those. That's a continuing issue, I think, for all of us as investors, is how are we backing up reconciliation and things with the third world.
I can just say on the fossil-free, the way that was designed and collaborating with key clients was...
I beat you.
So we essentially collaborated with our clients to come up with some framework that made the most sense. It was easy to understand, easy to implement. And we ended up cutting out all extraction, processing, and transportation of oil, gas, coal. And it was interesting seeing like Black Magontic, and I mean, we had to cut out shipping, you know, but even things that we hadn't expected, like all the utilities that pipe natural gas to homes, like they're all gone. So it was really an interesting process to go through and see what that all meant.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, in your process, did the conversation ever deal with lifestyle choices? We're such a dependent on society that's dependent on fossil fuels in everyday life that I'm just wondering where that aligns with divestment.
I can say something.
That was one of the key questions that came when we wrote our divestment primer. That we had to acknowledge that we are complicit because we're living in a society that depends on fossil fuels. And that none of us can say we're lily white pure. However, in spite of that, there are things that we can do, and that we shouldn't get demobilized by our sense of guilt. We have to have a sense of hope to do this, and our hope is that what we're doing will start to roll out and make quite a difference. So we wrote out in our divestment primer what we called a change model. And the change model is that through these actions they start snowballing, and that they then lead to this and to this and to ultimately to a society that's no longer dependent on these fossil fuels. So we were struggling with that whole concept right from the beginning. And when we took the divestment primer to our congregation and then had the discussion a week later with them about that and about the motions that we were going to take forward, that was a question that came again from the congregation. So we were hearing that. It came at conference, it came at presbytery, it came at every level. People are feeling, and they use it sometimes in an attack way. How dare you get up there and say that when you use plastics, or when you drive a car, or when you take a holiday. Well, our call, as I understand it, is to try to do justice, and we have to recognize that we're not perfect people. But we can't loll around in that, because it then keeps us from doing anything. Oh my gosh, I'm guilty, so I can't get up there. There's no easy answer to that question, but it's one that was with us every step of the way.
There could be a risk that having divested, you would say that's enough. But in our experience, in our reflections, divestment actually is an incentive to continue to find other ways to address these other issues. It doesn't. It's energizing, not demobilizing, and that's important. Right? Yes, there's lots of stuff to do. And we're on a hopefully only a 30-year journey to sort of get through the transition. One of the comments is that the things we need to do for the transition of producing the alternative energy and so on, that actually takes a lot of money, and at this point there isn't enough money being invested in that. And so there's actually need for, if you've got the money, there's need for it to be doing the positive things. And those companies are searching for sources of investment and so on. So we have the opportunities, and there is probably a bigger need. I don't think Shell needs more money, or the Shell investors need more money, but a lot of the people doing the alternative investment do need money to actually move the next stage. And in the background, of course, is our clear awareness that these companies have been fighting regulations that would help the transition. They're getting billions of dollars in subsidies from the government still, right? Whereas other people are not. The transition is big, and it's worth sort of looking at, and I guess we would feel we're part of the transition.
One last thing. Do any of you follow Jeremy Leggett, or have you read his book, Winning the Carbon War? Jeremy Leggett is amazing, and he is now switching his whole monthly writing to focus on 7 indicators of a healthy society, not just the transition from fossil fuels into clean energy. You can get him, I think it's just Jeremy Leggett, and the last is leggett.net. And then start reading him, because this is a man who owns a solar company, who's a member of the board, was chair of the board of Carbon Tracker, and but he's also a guy that I happen to know. He's a scientist. He worked with Greenpeace when I was in Greenpeace. He was at the International Greenpeace as one of our key climate scientists back in the early 90s. Fine man, and if you go and read his stuff, it just gives you so much energy and hope for going on to the next step. I would recommend him.
So first, I would second that. The book, The Winning of the Carbon War, is available free, sort of as an electronic download. It was a monthly blog leading up to Paris 2015, talking about all the meetings he was at with various places about, gone to Saudi Arabia, and they're investing. Saudi Arabia is investing heavily in trying to have an economy that by 2050 is not dependent on oil. They're going massively into solar. He's a key player in something called Solar Aid, which is producing small sort of charging lanterns and so on, distributed in West Africa and so on, so that people don't have to use kerosene in their huts at night and whatever. So he's well versed, and he's been in the circles of all of these sort of meetings. So it's an interesting insider's point of view in a lot of that by a thoughtful person who'd come out of somebody else.
So I was just going to congratulate you. What's most inspiring about your story, I think, is that you were, one small church, and you took on the United Church of Canada, which is just incredible. I'm going to remember that story and share it. So, and thanks for your transparency as well. So $600,000. You didn't say, "Oh, we only have $600,000. What can we do?" You actually did something, and mobilized a whole bunch of other dollars as well, like you say, with your parishioners in the church. So I guess my question was more around the divesting is kind of black and white, although I hear some questions around like how pure are you. But on the investing, then, as we know, there's like fewer and fewer options. Like you can't take the percentage if you're looking at a pure allocation perspective, and you've got so much allocated to energy. It's not likely that you're going to be able to take that all and find good investments in energy, like renewable energy. So what are your thoughts on things like looking at other companies that are doing things like Laura and I were talking about Apple, and their whole movement to renewable energy is one option. What are your thoughts on options of looking at other companies who are making, profound impact on their own policies around, as a substitute for that? Or would you prefer, let's put a lot of money into alternative energy because that's the way to go?
Basically, we did not try to do those kind of detail. When we go with Jeanne's, maybe JP can say more about them, but they're in the investment community what you call a quantitative investor. They've got a computer program with thousands of stocks in it and analyses of all of them, and they can go through and say not those for this reason, and we'll pick. So they're not your typical buy and hold. We'll pick 10 or 40 stocks and hold them forever. That's a different model, and that's probably a harder thing to do right now. I'm just thinking about the kind of managers we had with the pension fund and so on, and there were both kinds. Certainly, there are people in the private equity thing who are very much invested in a few companies and a few things, and some of that makes me nervous. Even if you say we're going to own companies delivering water to communities, I'm leery of private water companies and the way they behave and so on. So it gets to be very, very intensive to try to do that well. And so we chose not to go that route. And I'm aware of Apple. I'm aware of Tesla. I don't know whether sending 2 people around the moon is a great use of energy. That's what Elon Musk is up to right now. I'm sure that a lot of the companies people end up with would include companies like Apple, but that hasn't been something we've focused on.
I could say a couple. Just, I would say that at this point, there's definitely no limitations on scale in terms of making positive impact or investing in positive companies. You talked about the Clean 200. We created a public impact equity fund that was a global fund, and we have a universe that's around 150 companies that we then try to pick the best. So these are 150 companies that we think are making the biggest positive difference environmentally and socially through their products and services, and then we try to pick a portfolio of 30 companies that we also think will beat the markets financially and provide those kind of returns that people want. But I think at this stage, certainly in the public space, there's lots of companies that you can invest in. Private-wise, there's deal flow issues and other things that might make it harder. And that's really one of the big trends that we're seeing is people wanting to make more positive impact, and they want to scale that up. But it's just, there's only so much you can do in the private or venture markets, not only for deal flow reasons, but also around risk. Risk and return and those opportunity costs, so people aren't comfortable maybe doing more than 5 or 10%. And then how do we scale up more? And I think that's got to be in the public markets for liquidity reasons. Through these leading impact companies or green bonds offer, it's early days, but there's great potential there too.
Back in the back.
Hi, I'm Monica Lampton. I'm with the Congregation of Notre Dame, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about what happened with the pushback from Alberta, and if you had, and Saskatchewan, and if you had done any legwork in advance of that, other than just anticipating it, or what's been done for the reconciliation. We have many C&D sisters in the Atlantic, and particularly in the Sydney, Nova Scotia area. And one of the big challenges that we have that's concerning to us is that there is a new coal-burning energy plant that has been promised to Sydney. And there is the first sign of real hope in that community now around their future, because they have been one of the hardest hardest hit economic areas of the country, and then with the collapse of Alberta, even the workers from there are heading home. And I really liked what you said about hope and having to do this work with hope. And it's so hard for us to try and work with a community that is really investing all of their hope in something like a coal-fired energy plant. So I was thinking maybe we could learn a bit from your experience with Alberta and Saskatchewan, but also a little bit wondering how your faith-based approach, if you were able to address with them the idea of hope and kind of a switch of hope.
What we at Trinity St. Paul's did is very little. I can't give you concrete examples of what we did other than to write in our divestment primer about what the risks are of divestment. And a lot of them had to do with some of these bigger things. And the other risk was alienating our sister congregations in Alberta and Saskatchewan. The National United Church, however, when they took their decision, immediately set up at the General Council rooms for listening and hearing those concerns coming from those communities. They have done some pastoral follow-up in those regions. We haven't done it, but the National United Church is engaged. And I can't tell you a lot about that, really, other than that we did have a call from one of the National United Church magazines to address this issue. And what we did was to refer it to Greg Powell, who had worked with us, who's now a minister in Castlegar, BC, because he's on the ground among that discussion that's going on, and I think that's way better than having someone from Toronto trying to address that. So I think there are things being held there by that, and you know, I can't give you an answer on that. I mean, it happens. Our question around this was ourselves to say, well, whatever happened to the people in the tobacco industry? What has happened to people in the other industries where we've divested from and moved back from? And I think the church nationally has more of experience in that than we do as a local congregation. We have to admit that I think it was exceptional that our congregation voted unanimously to support this, which meant we had enormous support and willingness to do this, but that's a tough one. Some of you may have a better answer than we do.
Someone asked me that actually at the break, and I think obviously one of the issues is, are those communities able to develop a plan for the next 30 years that sees them not dependent on the fossil fuel? So you go to Alberta, the same drilling things that are searching for oil and so on could be doing geothermal, which they have enormous resources for. And I didn't actually ever see good press coverage saying, we have a plan and we're going to use the geothermal and have an economy which is in fact carbon neutral in 30 years. That's what seems to me to be missing on the part of all kinds of leadership. There's something, it's not actually addressing your question, but it is something that was a flaw, I think, in our system within the United Church. As we prepared our motions and divestments and so on, we were working our way through all these different levels to a vote. At no point was there a process for us who were saying we want to do investment to meet with divestment, to meet with the people at the national office who were doing the investment and talk about which motions they would find they could work with well and which would be problematic. So there were some other side motions that were passed at the same time that said, when you reinvest in community resources, reinvest. And these were some things they don't actually have good ways to do. So I would say if you can possibly have a way as you move forward to actually talk to, work with the people who are currently doing the investments so that you're not sort of in silos. You're going to have to work with them in the medium term if you're going to be successful, and I would like any organization that's doing that to have abilities to do that. Universities are one of the places that are struggling with it. There's a nice story on the web about Trinity College Dublin, where the fossil-free students sort of thing set up an event, and a majority of the Board of Governors showed up at it and said, how can we work with you? Well, that's a whole different scene than setting up a battle. And it would be ideal if you can have those kind of conversations within your community.
That just reminded me that at the Alberta conference meeting that preceded the vote at the national level, there was a motion passed that there needed to be a working group set up to look at what a fossil-free Alberta would look like. So there is some work happening there in Alberta.
Thank you, and I'd like to call on Anne-Marie Jackson to thank Jeanne